I shot my last video on what was happening in artificial intelligence in the immediate aftermath of the craze that was brought about by ChatGPT, and I thought it would be time for an update. As a reminder, I've been intensely using some of the new so-called generative AI tools for a little over 2 years, starting with image generation programs like Midjourney, including paid subscriptions, and then moving on to systems like the various OpenAI models, GPT-3, GPT-4, 4.0, and so forth. The music generation modules like Suno.ai, as well as other models more recently like Claude 3.7. I've been using these tools for a large number of purposes, or at least trying them out. The typical things like helping with coding, although my current role means I don't do a whole bunch of coding. I've been able to do more coding in the last year or two than I would have been doing in the previous years to that, just because these tools have made it much more accessible to do coding for someone who's only doing it occasionally. I've been using them for things like image generation, for video generation, experiments, using them in things like social media posts in terms of writing fellowship or prize applications, used them extensively in early stage ideation, and have used them in workshopping or prototyping new algorithmic approaches in research. What I want to do in the remainder of this video is just cover a few key concepts that really reflect how I think about these tools, how I'm using these tools, what I think they're good for and not good for, and conclude with where I think this is all going. Probably the single most important observation, especially compared to what other people are saying, is in my experience, these AI tools are helping existing experts more than they are helping anyone else. So in my area, the way these tools have been most helpful is when three particular things have come together. The first is that I have known exactly what I want to do. So these are tasks where, given enough time and enough effort, I could probably do it myself, but I'm using the tool to do it faster and perhaps better in some particular aspects. The second aspect of it is I am able and experienced at giving very detailed, nuanced instructions to these tools. So I am giving many paragraphs of detailed, specific instructions about what to do, in what order, highlighting some of the things that may go wrong, explaining, so to speak, some of the nuances of what I'm asking them to do, and in general giving very detailed, very rich instruction. I found that these tools are particularly good when you can do so. And finally, being able to very, very quickly and easily and effortlessly assess the quality of the output of these tools, again, which is only a thing you can do if you are already an expert in the thing that you're using the tool to do. When all three of those things are combined, I found that these tools are like really adding a superpower to my daily, activities. And that's where I found them to be most impactful. When you only have, say, 2 out of those 3 factors, it can still be very helpful. But it's a combination of those 3 factors together that I think is really transformative. The second key observation is really how you go about investigating and integrating these tools into your daily workflows. And I think there's really 2 broad ways to go about this, and one way I think is far more effective than the other. So the first way is that you have a set of prescribed tasks that you need to get done with certain outcomes, and you rigidly go about trying to force these tools to help you with those tasks. In some areas, the tasks are going to be easily doable by the tools. But in a lot of areas, you'll be frustrated or surprised because the tools are either not capable or have just not been developed enough in certain areas. And that is where I think a lot of these attempts to integrate AI into workflows more than they already are have really come unstuck. I learned this many, many years ago, about 15 years ago, when I was writing some early AI chatbots that I used in various business initiatives. And I found that rather than trying to force it to do A, B, C, and D, I was much better off exploring and investigating what they were really good at and then working around their strengths and limitations. And I think that's still very much true in the modern age of AI. One of the other interesting insights I've learned, at least, about using these systems, and I'm going to word this carefully so it doesn't sound like I'm saying that people suck. So These systems are particularly useful in two scenarios. The first scenario is when you are tired, not particularly motivated, a little bit cranky, just not feeling it. These tools are very useful for enabling you to achieve a certain level of productivity even when you are far from your best. They're not going to be perfect, but you are able to keep ideating or keep generating or polishing some written text even though your heart's not really in it. And I think that's one difference to before, when it would have been very difficult to keep momentum in a certain area if you're basically just not motivated to do it. The second scenario is, I guess, contrasting working with one of these AI tools to perhaps working with another person. Now, I love working with people. It's one of the main highlights of my job, but I think this contrast is really useful nevertheless, which is simply, I don't really feel any guilt about asking, for example, ChatGPT to do something for me. Obviously, there is the background issue of energy usage and the ethics of how these models were trained, but in terms of the day-to-day usage, I don't mind giving it garbled instructions. I don't really care if there are typos in it. These systems are incredibly resilient to typos, is one of the things I and many others have discovered. And so I will throw stuff at it just to try it out much more willingly than I will on a person, because I feel an obligation to treat that person with respect, to make sure I give them meaningful work to do. And that is not necessarily the bar for working with these tools, which enables you to try a lot of stuff really quickly without giving it too much thought, in a way that you just couldn't do with people, even if you have that talent resource to work with. The main challenges I have with using these tools in my current day-to-day revolve around two or three key components. The first is how you set up the problem or task that you want assistance with. And so, especially in the early days, you would almost inevitably have to compartmentalize the task into subcomponents. In order to do that appropriately, you'd need to know what the eventual solution is likely to look like in order to set up those individual modules correctly, as well as have an idea about how those modules will interface with each other. This could be equally well applied to if you're doing sophisticated coding or if you're writing a long grant proposal. More recently, some of these systems, especially systems I found like Claude 3.7, I think it was able to do relatively sophisticated algorithmic approaches in code in one shot, but still there was a limit to it. And so this general decision about how much to pre-prepare the instructions and the problems you're setting it and modularize it in order to make it more tractable is something that I have to continually consider, and which is always evolving over time. The second key tension I've had is when you've repeatedly iterated with a system in order to achieve something, and no matter what you've been doing, it hasn't been able to do it, you face this tension of, am I failing to instruct it or prompt it or interact with it in the right way? Or is it fundamentally incapable of doing this particular thing I would like it to do? And knowing how far to push that and when to cut your losses and just do it manually. And again, this comes back to this point earlier, that you often get the most benefit when you are capable of doing all of these tasks yourself, if push comes to shove. But knowing when to switch back to manual only operation is one of the key challenges that I continue to grapple with. And this challenge continues to the final stages of whatever you're working on. So I found in some situations, using these AI tools to help you put the final polish on whatever it is you're working on can be very helpful. But in a lot of other situations, the final stages are the stages which most benefit from your personal so-called human touch, and therefore you should switch back to an entirely manual process. And again, knowing ahead of time which of those two situations is going to eventuate is not easy to predict. And so that's another ongoing challenge that I face in integrating these tools into everyday use. So where do I see the general field going right now? Well, in my personal experience, and I would never claim that a professor is representative of a typical career, these AI tools have become a key regular part of my professional career. Now, if they were to suddenly disappear tomorrow, I would be very, very annoyed, and I would probably drop some productivity, but I would still be fine. I don't think that could be said of necessarily people who are earlier in their career who have perhaps integrated these tools even more closely into their workflows. And that's something that's interesting to think about, considering who controls and generates a lot of these systems. In terms of the impact on professions and careers, I think people would be correct in saying that there was an incredible amount of hype when ChatGPT initially came out, that there was substantive disruption, but nowhere near the amount of disruption perhaps alluded to, and that I think people are now saying, well, most of that disruption's now been done. I think that is not necessarily true. I still think the biggest potential disruptions and transformations in how a lot of professional careers operate are still to come. I think they've been slower than predicted, perhaps initially, for two reasons. Firstly, even if you had the most perfect set of AI tools, both digital and physical, there is still inertia in terms of bringing these systems into practice. There are lots of other factors, like human factors, like contracts and all sorts of other things, which means that even if the technology is perfect, which it is not, the actual time for it to be introduced and disrupt industries varies and is often much slower than you might expect. And the second key factor, I think, is just general inertia. And so I think it will take time for some of these changes to come through. I think in some areas, a lot of these changes are being slowed down by general, I guess, apathy is the wrong word, but generally there not being enough of a pressure point to adopt these technologies. And so instead, the biggest disruptions are often coming from people who are opportunistically seeing this as an opportunity, adopting these technologies. But I think, for example, if there are recessions or other pressures, I think you may see the impact of these technologies becoming more apparent, especially when people regard them as being able to do some subset of what has traditionally been regarded as people-only capabilities. I'm still pretty optimistic about these technologies. I think we've got to obviously balance the positivity and excitement around what these technologies could possibly do with a lot of their potential downfalls, and recognize that these technologies in a way are not inherently good or bad themselves, but a lot of it is how society responds to them, how government regulates them, but also supports them, and whether existing sources of, I guess, equitable or inequitable treatment are exacerbated or perhaps mitigated by these technologies. And you could easily see it going in both directions. And indeed, like most past technologies, it probably will go in both directions, but I am still optimistic that the overall net effect will be positive.